My name is John Blades. I'm the director of the Flagler Museum, and this is the 26th annual Whitehall Lecture Series. In fact, it's the last lecture for the season in the Whitehall Lecture Series. This year, the theme of the lecture series was built around the architects who gave Palm Beach its iconic look. We've talked about, of course, Carrere and Hastings, who designed Whitehall and many other great buildings around the nation. We've talked about Joseph Urban, who built three of our iconic buildings here in Palm Beach, and about whom we have an exhibit on the second floor I hope you've had a chance to see. And we've talked about Schultz and Weaver, who created that Villa Medici writ gigantic over on the ocean that we call the Breakers. And we're going to wind up our lecture series talking about Addison Mizner, who built so many homes here in Palm Beach, about 2/3 of which still exist, and has much to do with the overall look of Palm Beach. I want to take just a second to remind all of you to make sure your cell phones are off. Please don't assume that they're off. Please check them to make sure that they're actually off. And if you happen to wander in with an audio tour wand, I want you to raise your hand so we can come collect that wand. You won't need it here for the lecture, and those wands can sometimes interfere with the electronics in the room. Actually, sometimes the electronics in the room can set off the alarm on the wand, which is pretty startling. I want to take a second to mention that these lectures go out live on the web so that they can be seen and heard by anyone, anywhere in the world who cares to join us. The people who join us in the virtual lecture hall will not only hear the audio as you do, but they see the same slides you do as well. So if you happen to be traveling and you'd like to join one of these lectures sometime in the future, you can certainly do that. Others do. In fact, we have a number of people who joined us this afternoon for the lecture, including someone from Scotland who's joined us, I think, for almost all of our lectures. The time difference there must be, 5 or 6 hours? So we're talking about somebody enjoying a nice evening at a little after 9 o'clock probably, or 8 o'clock in Scotland. Thank you for joining us, those of you who joined us online. I want to take just a second to thank our sponsors, PNC, our lead sponsor for this lecture series, a great member of the community here, and a sponsor who's been with the museum for many years and sponsors a number of other programs at the museum as well as the Palm Beach Post, who's been a longtime sponsor of many programs here at the museum. Sponsors help make these programs manageable for the museum and possible for all of us to enjoy. I want to thank the staff who helps us set up these lecture series and runs to get all the extra chairs for the last minute sales. Appreciate their hard work. And at this point, I want to introduce our speaker, Carol Seebohm. We asked to join our lecture series this year because she wrote a book on Addison Mizner, which we may, I'm looking back at the staff at the back of the room, we may have sold out of already. We could only find a few copies of the book. It's been out of print for a while. I wish it would come back into print. I'm sure Carol does too. But Carol had access to Mizner materials that not every author has had access to. In fact, some that no other authors have had access to, I believe. So we thought she would be the perfect person to join us for the Whitehall Lecture Series to enlighten us about Mizner in ways that we probably haven't heard of or been aware of before. So I'm counting on you, Carol, to surprise us with a few things. Please join me. She's, by the way, a prolific author. She's written a number of novels and biographies, and she also writes for House and Garden, New York Times, and Town and Country. So she's a busy author. Carol, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining the Whitehall Lecture. I'm already had to be corrected. It's Caroline.
Well, sorry, I just like to get the name right. Thank you all for coming. I always listen to the advice of a friend of mine before a talk who said, be brief, be brilliant, be gone. So I'll try at least to hold on to 2 of those instructions. I'd like to clear up first a few misconceptions. Often people, not present of course, but people up in the north or outside the Florida area think that Addison Mizner is a building. They see Mizner Estates, Mizner Park, the Hotel, Mizner Hotel, Addison's restaurant. Seems to be an interesting building person. Well, of course, I'm here to tell you that he is not a building. Ironically, however, the first book I ever wrote, the first biography I ever wrote, was of a man called Condé Nast. Now, as I went around the city saying, oh, they said, the Condé Nast building. Oh, it's on Lexington Avenue. So I seem to be fated to write about men who people think are buildings. However, today we will clear all that up. Addison Mizner was a man, an architect, and a character. So let's start at the beginning. They all say that behind every great man was a great woman. This is Ella Mizner, Addison's mother. She had 8 children, one of whom died, and so she was left with 6 boys and 1 girl. Addison was the second youngest, born in 1872. The youngest was Wilson, who you may not be very interested in at the moment, but he's going to pop up throughout this talk. Mama Mizner thought that Wilson was the favorite of all time, and she called him Mama's Angel Birdie. Angel Birdie, he was not. And you will see that it was one of Addison's banes of his existence, was this younger brother. They lived quite well in California. He grew up in Benicia, California. His father was a lawyer, Lansing Mizner, and he was a prosperous lawyer, and Benicia at that time was considered almost the capital of California. So it was a very thriving city, and he did well, so well, that he was appointed ambassador to Latin America. And for a while, the family moved to Guatemala City. Now this, bear in mind, was the city with most beautiful, beautiful mission colonial architecture. So Addison was exposed to this kind of beauty at a very early age. He also was exposed to monkeys. He had a pet monkey in Guatemala, and you will see that monkeys tend to pop up again in Addison's life. He also, at some point during this period of his youth, he injured his leg jumping over a fire at a July the 4th celebration. Now, this leg also comes back. What I love about all these stories is how themes of his life come back later. So remember the leg. Addison did not do very much in the educational department. He traveled, he went in and out of schools, rather like his younger brother. He did not graduate from anywhere, I'm sorry to say, but he was a sort of jolly-looking boy, and he had lots of friends. And he also learned to paint and draw very well. And so that was very much part of his experience as a child. As he grew up, he then went around the world. He traveled quite a bit. But the seminal thing for him was when his father died, when Addison was 21, in 1893. Now, his father, after this success as an ambassador, kind of returned under a cloud. There was some fuss about he was supposed to have arrested a rebel, and the United States government weren't pleased with him. So he came back rather in disgrace, and he then became a depressive and sank into gloom and never made any more money. So when he died, the Mizner family was very, very financially strapped. So this is when Addison decided he must do something for the family, and he signed on as an architect with the firm of Willis Polk in San Francisco. Now, I want to immediately say this is always said that Mizner never did an architectural education. He was 2 years in the office of Willis Polk, who was a young up-and-coming architect, very interested in vernacular architecture, mission architecture. They went and studied the Spanish colonial buildings in California, and Addison started to learn to be a draftsman, to do blueprints, and he got a very basic, good education during those years. However, being a young architect in California was not easy, and he didn't find a way to make money. Meanwhile, this went out about the 1890s. the gold rush was happening, and lots of people were going through San Francisco on the way to the Yukon or Alaska to find gold. Needless to say, the Mizner brothers thought this might be a quick way to make some money. So off they went to the Yukon, Wilson and Addison and their older brother. The older brother got there first, took one look around the Yukon, sent a cable back saying, "This place is for the young, strong, and stupid." So he went home. But Wilson and Addison went on up there, and Addison, like the good brother, got a kind of cabin and signed up for a stake and started work. Wilson, Mama's angel birdie, was certainly not stupid, and he saw that the thing was not definitely to start digging for gold through some very incompatible ice and have a horrible time and be miserable. So what Wilson did was opened a bar in Dawson City, and it was filled with tutti fruttis that he imported from places, and it did very well. The other thing Wilson did, this is just to show the brotherly complications here, Wilson made a very good friend with one of the weighers, because when you found any gold, you had to bring it back, and a weigher would weigh how much it was and then give you some money. So Wilson got a friend who was a weigher and told him to put sort of gel or syrup in his hair. So when he was weighing the gold, any little flakes of gold, he would then do that. Sorry. He'd do this, and lo and behold, when they went away, there'd be lots of lovely flecks of gold in the weigher's hair that he would then split with Wilson. This was Wilson's way of digging for gold. It didn't do brilliantly, but Wilson had a good time up there. Actually, poor old Addison had a horrible time up there and was very unhappy. And so he decided to come home, and he thought, I've got to somehow make my living as an architect. And he said he would go to New York. On the way to New York, he found himself in Honolulu, where a friend of his had said there's going to be a wonderful building commission in Honolulu with the royal family. They want to build something fabulous. So Addison arrives in Honolulu. Needless to say, there was no commission, there was no job. But clever old Addison, who is a good artist by this time, remember, sets up as an art restorer. And the Honolulu paintings of the royal family are all in terrible disarray. So here's a portrait of Napoleon III with Addison in his art restorer's outfit, restoring for the royal family. Didn't last an awfully long time, let's face it. But he did a bit of good work there, and he sold watercolours to tourists coming through. But he knew that in the end he had to still settle down. So New York it was. So he had a friend there, very useful friend, a woman who was an heiress called Tessie Ulrichs, who originally came from San Francisco, and she'd moved to New York. And so she was there hanging out with all the other rich women of New York. And Addison became introduced to these women, and of course he was very popular because already he had rather good stories to tell, and he traveled a lot. He was very amusing, and he was single, and he was a man. What's not to like? So he did very well with the friends, and he got a few commissions. He did build a few houses. I'll show you one later. And also he became friends with Mrs. Alva Belmont, the great lady who'd built Marble House in Newport. And she asked him to build her a house, and he did lots of designs which never worked out. But basically he was learning, and he did okay in New York for a while. And he had a lot of fun. They wrote a poem about him when he was in New York. All down Fifth and Madison, they love our baby Addison. And even, 'tis surmised, on Broadway and the Bowery, they trail his accents flowery, but that's not advertised. You get the implication. He was also hanging out at a few of the gay bars downtown in a very discreet way, because of course he was not going to offend his wonderful, rich female clients. Well, meanwhile, Mama's Angel Birdie, remember him? Mama's Angel Birdie, finding that Addison was doing rather well with rich widows, immediately appeared in New York to kind of hop onto the bandwagon, and cleverly managed to marry a rich widow called Myra Yerkes. How he did it, we don't want to know. But anyway, he got her to marry him, and Addison was furious because he knew it was going to be a disaster and he knew it was going to be bad for his career. So Addison goes rushing into the Fifth Avenue mansion where his brother is lying on a satin bed with a cigar in his mouth. And Addison says, "What are you doing here?" And Mama's angel birdie says, "It's very comfortable and the service here is excellent." So he managed to hang on for a few weeks, and then, needless to say, the marriage was annulled. But then, poor Addison, things were going all right, but not all right enough. And then the great miracle occurred, which we will now look at. This is Paris Singer. And Paris Singer appeared on the scene at the most important moment in Addison Mizner's life. It was in December 1917. And they were both at a very low ebb. Addison, by this time, was 45. You know, he was no spring chicken by this time. And he'd had his usual career crises, no work, no money. Moreover, muggers had attacked him on his way home, injuring his leg again. Remember that leg? And there was another discussion of amputation, which was just a terrifying thought. And Wilson, Mama's angel birdie, right on the money as usual, arranged for a song and dance man to come and perform for poor Addison, who was laid up in his room with his leg, sort of stuck up like this. So this song and dance man came into the room and did a sort of like this, making the floor shake. And Addison said to his brother, "Look, please stop him. I mean, this is more painful than the leg was before this man started his song and dance." And it turned out that the song and dance man had only one leg. And the whole idea was that Addison would see what fun he could have if he had to have his leg amputated. This was Wilson's idea of a joke. Paris Singer was depressed for a different reason. He had just divorced after a very, very tempestuous marriage to Isadora Duncan, and he was on his own, and he also was not well. And they met and they just hit it off. It was a wonderful, wonderful thing right from the beginning. They became friends. And Singer had a personal nurse who was an English woman called Joan. And Joan took a look at the leg of Addison and said, "What you both need is a warm climate. Why don't you go somewhere warm, like Palm Beach, Florida, where you can both get better?" So that's where they went. No, this isn't Palm Beach, Florida at all. This is a chateau in France. And this is the kind of building that in those days rich people wanted to build for their palaces and mansions in the sort of hot weather. And actually, also on Fifth Avenue, if you look still, there are houses that are sort of built with these turrets. So that was one kind of architecture that was very desirable. The other kind of was this sort of neoclassical style, columns, rather austere, sort of blocky, but beautiful, excuse me. And that was very, very popular with the rich people of the early 1900s. So that was the other kind of style. The third kind of style, this, it turns out, was one of Addison Mizner's houses, built in Connecticut in the 1900s. I call it Mizner uncertain, because it's quite clear he didn't know what he was doing. A sort of strange stone bottom and the stucco and the dormer windows. I don't think he'd quite got it by that time. But, miracle of miracles, they got down to Palm Beach, and Addison Mizner drew this. The original is around, and it's a beautiful sort of pen and ink drawing. And this is, the writing isn't underneath it, but it says, "This is going to be a convalescent home." We talked at breakfast about whether it really was going to be a convalescent home, because there were other possibilities. But it really was started as a convalescent home that Paris Singer had envisaged to be somewhere for the soldiers, because we were still in World War I, for the returning soldiers to come and have a place, a sort of place to recover. So he asked Mizner to design him a convalescence home. So for the whole spring and summer of 1918, Mizner got to work. And he got to work in a way that he'd never got to work before. He got the tiles, the terracotta, the arches. He had an absolute vision, which this is a very modest version of, but he had a vision, and he was allowed, thanks to Paris Singer and Paris Singer's checkbook, to build it. I'd like to read you, this is from the Palm Beach Post, the shiny sheet as was, in 1918, before the end of the First World War, when Addison was building this place. It's written by a journalist called Joe, excuse me, who was the editor-in-chief of the Palm Beach Post. Sorry. It's this dry climate. Okay, like all celebrities, this is about Addison, he likes to smoke cigarettes, dream, and talk. His conversation is, as a rule, trivial, until pinned down, and then he has a world of interesting information or conversation good to hear. He has an observing turn, and this is the secret of his ability as an architect. He is the best pudding for mosquitoes that I ever saw. They work on him fast and vicious. He walks around the various projects with a bottle of mosquito chaser and a small sprayer. His office on Gardenia Street is carefully screened, and this is where he does what he calls his sketching. He is what I call a regular temperamental nut, but like all others that excel in their profession, he is one of the very best, and Palm Beach County should be pleased beyond measure that this great architect is drawing plans for the alleviation of our wounded sailors and soldiers, which will add renown to Palm Beach County. So this is, to me, a wonderful image of Addison at the beginning of his Palm Beach career. They loved him already. He was already being a character, and he was already doing great work. So they decided to put this building on Lake Worth. This is an early picture where there was very little building yet, and there was an alligator farm, and there was Bailey's Casino, but basically it was a kind of swamp. So Mizner had to really, really find the building materials and the builders and build the building. And this is an example. I'm sure you've all seen these early pictures of the Everglades. But anyway, what happened was, November 1918, the war was over. So what was going to happen? Where were all these returning soldiers and sailors? They certainly weren't going to be coming home for a very long time. So Paris Singer said, of course, we're going to turn it into a private club. We're going to turn it into the Everglades. So this was Mizner's first wonderful, wonderful job. Arches, columns, turrets, terracotta, everything that really became the signature of Addison Mizner. Everybody was thrilled. Everybody had never seen such a magnificent building in Palm Beach. None more so than Mrs. Edward Stotesbury of Philadelphia. By this time, there were many snowbirds already coming down. Thank you, Flagler, for building the railroad. So now there were many people coming from the north for the winter, and they wanted houses. Now, Mrs. Stotesbury had already hired an architect to do her Palm Beach mansion. And she had in Philadelphia a kind of one of those neoclassical things that I showed you earlier. So she was going the neoclassical route. But Eva Stotesbury took one look at the Everglades and said, I want one of those. And she got it. So El Mirasol was the Stotesbury house built in 1919 and was probably the first and the most elaborate of all Mizner's private houses. I'm going to show you several pictures because it really shows Mizner's kind of complete flowering as a visionary architect. He loved using the climate. He loved making light and shade. He loved using greenery. He loved courtyards. All the things that he'd seen when he was a young man in Guatemala City and in the mission areas of California. So he made all these beautiful, this big, spacious room, the coffered ceiling, the grill work, the light, the great, huge fireplace at the end. He loved big stone fireplaces. And he used Pecky cypress, which was a rather unwell-regarded wood at the time because it has long knots in it and looks rather strange, but he showed how beautiful it could be with wash, and so he used Pecky cypress and also coquina stone, which is a kind of porous coral stone, which also people hadn't used before. So he was very creative right from the start once he got here. And this is what was called in El Mirasol the Moorish cloister. He loved cloisters, and he put cloisters in all his houses. And this was a very good way of getting air in and breezes through, and the sunlight was protected. It was a wonderful way to do it. And I also like to think of all his clients. Mrs. Stotesbury, say, in one of her flowing gowns, walking down the Moorish cloister and feeling rather like a nun in a convent. It was very good for the spirit. So there's Mrs. Stotesbury in her Moorish cloister. Here is the garden at the back of El Mirasol. This is another wonderful Mizner thing. He loved canals of water, and this is a beautiful canal with the crazy paving and the trees and some guests looking lovely. And then this is, again, the back of the house. Great. He loved water because, of course, all Moorish gardens have water, and all places which are basically hot and dry and desert need water. So he used water in all his houses. And this is a picture of the front of the house. Now, I showed a lot of the Mirasol house because you can't see it anymore. It was demolished in 1959. You can see, actually, if you drive down the North County Road, as you probably all know, you see the El Mirasol Road, and you can see the gate, or one of the gates to the house, which is the only thing that's still extant. Anyway, after this masterpiece, commissions flooded in. Mizner became the hero of the town, indeed of Florida. Everyone wanted what Mrs. Stotesbury had, and they also wanted Addison. He was, again, incredibly popular. He was a man, he was brilliant, he was popular, he was desirable, and he was single. And so here he is with his friends, Mrs. David Calhoun and Paris Singer. Is the furthest on the left with the hat. I'm very partial to Paris Singer's knees. I think nobody else has ever seen Paris Singer's knees the way we have in this photograph. And next to him is Joan, the English nurse, remember? He married her, very sensible. So he had a nurse at home to look after him, and she was very good to Singer for the rest of his life. And so there all the four friends are together. And here's Addison in his fancy dress costume with Louise Munn, whose house he built, and a very social man called William Rhinelander Stewart. He went to all the balls, Addison did. He had at least 2 monkeys, one of which he would wear on his shoulder like a wrap. And he had chow dogs, which he loved. And one of the monkeys, perhaps you know this, was buried near his own house, the Villa Mizner. One of the monkeys is buried, and there's a little marker, and it says, Johnny Brown, the human monkey, died April 30th, 1927. So he loved his animals, and he loved his work, and he was having a good time. Needless to say, Mama's angel Birdie showed up. Realizing that Addison was having rather a lot of success in Palm Beach, he showed up with a woman who was not his wife, but he told everybody it was his wife. By this time, Wilson was actually becoming a little successful himself. He'd become a kind of comedy writer and a columnist for the New York newspapers, and was a kind of commentator. He also ran a brothel and a kind of druggy place in New York, so he was generally getting along with his life. So Addison, who was not thrilled to see him, but felt he was duty-bound to his mother to look after his little brother, built a house for Wilson which is now on Worth Avenue. You can't see it anymore. I think it's been torn down also. But he built a house for Wilson, and he did a beautiful living room with lovely murals painted on the walls. Lovely. So one day, Addison goes into Wilson's house, and the murals have all been painted over white. So Addison says, oh, why did you do that? So Wilson says, so I could see the mosquitoes. So he could swap them, you see. Thank you, Mama's angel birdie. Anyway, between 1919 and 1925, Addison built over 40 houses. That's an average of 8 houses a year. And about 25 or so remain, mostly altered beyond recognition, but not all. And that's a very fine record. You know, unlike Frank Lloyd Wright and even, I believe now, Frank Gehry, whose buildings are beginning to fall apart, Addison's buildings lasted. So he was very careful with all this. And in fact, he made a whole pottery to make the beautiful furnishings and furniture that went into the houses, the pottery, the ironwork, and he got trained people to work the kilns. He had special kilns for the bricks. And he also went on a lot of shopping trips to Europe with his clients in order to buy tapestries and paintings and sconces and all the sort of beautiful things that went into these houses. Now, he liked these trips, but sometimes he got a little weary of these women who kept traveling with him. And he used to say he wished he was a doctor, because doctors could chloroform their patients. He also got a bit impatient sometimes with his clients who kind of pestered him about the details of the building, which certainly Addison was not really great at. He didn't love all this attention to all this. And one of his clients said, well, maybe I could see the elevations of the house you're building for me. And Addison looked at him and said, elevations? How can I give you elevations when we haven't even built the house? It's typical Addison. And he also added, anyway, he said, I haven't seen my elevations since I topped the 250-pound mark. This is Via Mizner, where he would put his beautiful objects for sale. He was like the originator of the mall, and he would bring his things out and people could go choose them. And this was another way of selling his products, very successful. And of course, the monkey's grave is sort of round the corner there. Anyway, the more successful he got, the more annoyed people became with him. People said, of course, that he had no architectural training, which we know was wrong. They said, for instance, in one case, he had forgotten to put a staircase in. This was much written about. And they used this example, it's the Rasmussen house. They used this as an example where he'd had to add the staircase on, this great curling staircase, afterwards. Well, I am here to tell you that I saw the blueprints in the Historical Society of Palm Beach County, and the staircase is right on the floor plans. So there was not a question of forgetting it at all. But they said, he's really a con man, he didn't work ever, he didn't go to the Beaux-Arts in Paris, he didn't study with McKim, Mead and White, he didn't work with Carrere and Hastings. Who is this person? They were annoyed with him. And writer Albert Johnson wrote about his work. This is a description of bastard Spanish, Moorish, Romanesque, Gothic, Renaissance, bull market, damn the expense style. So this was where people thought that Mizner was not quite good enough for his job, but actually, of course, he was. They were wrong, and he was right. But then, disaster struck. In 1925, in the middle of the bull market, some developers who had been looking at Palm Beach decided that Boca Raton, which nobody had ever heard of, was going to be the next new place putting Palm Beach to shame. And Addison Mizner, of course, being the god of Palm Beach, was going to be the designer of this new paradise. There would be canals, and this is a picture of the canals, parks, a theatre, an opera house, beautiful, beautiful mansions, the first tailor-made city in all the world. It was a revolutionary idea, actually. And Mama's angel Birdie got rather interested in this, and he hired some gondoliers from Venice, and brought them over in order to be ready to go up and down the canals with their gondolas. Very expensive project. Thousands of people invested. Thousands believed in this corporation. There was going to be the Mizner Development Corporation, which was going to give them all heaven for the future. A new hotel, the Ritz-Carlton, was going to go up, the pinnacle of this magic. And gradually, just like too recently, things began to fall apart. Suddenly, everyone panicked. Nothing was going up, nothing was happening. The banks didn't want to lend anymore. They didn't like it. Everyone took their money out. It was a bloodbath. The hotel just opened. Everyone else, including Addison, lost everything. Banks folded, lawsuits. There was nothing built except a few lampposts. Pathetic. And then, of course, in 1929, everything that had not yet collapsed. So Mizner never recovered. He got some other assignments, and actually he had built in Boca Raton some beautiful little houses in old Floresta, which, if anybody finds it, should go and look at. They're little houses that were for the workers that still exist. But basically, Mizner was exhausted, he was broke, and significantly, his work was going out of fashion. No more those wonderful turrets and the terracotta and the fountains and the ornate mouldings. What people wanted now were glass and steel, cubist styles, abstract styles. The international style, it was called. That's what everybody wanted. Mizner's work was regarded as old hat, old-fashioned, impractical. And of course, nobody could afford, in the 1930s with the Depression, to build Mizner-style houses. What they wanted to build, if they could afford it, was this kind of thing. And so Mizner no longer had work. And so people wanted this, or if they did try and do a bit of Mizner, they would do copies which weren't quite right, overdone, proportions wrong, showing how actually Mizner was the only one who could do it well. So it was a sad time for Mizner. His clients gave him a little money to survive, but he didn't really survive. And in 1933, he died owing $30,000 with $200 in the bank or something, really. Meanwhile, Mama's angel Birdie in Hollywood, hearing he was very ill, sent a telegram. "Stop dying. I'm trying to write a comedy." So that was his last words. So there isn't even a marker for Addison Mizner's grave. He's buried in California. His ashes went back to California, where his niece was living. And I went to the cemetery. Nothing there. It's very sad. Somebody should do something about that. Anyway, so the end of Mizner, we think, wrong. About a few years later, many years later, 1970s, suddenly it all came back. People wanted this beautiful, beautiful, elegant, romantic architecture. They wanted the courtyards, they wanted the fountains. His work became valuable again. Everyone said they had a Mizner house, even if they didn't. And all these names of the Mizner estates became fashionable and exciting. So Mizner suddenly became the one, the icon, as John said earlier. He became the icon of this particular island. Now, I took this rather bad photograph of the Villa Encantada, which is a Mizner house that he built in 1928, rather towards the end of his life. That the house is not one of the biggest and grandest. It was in Manalapan. And it was a lovely house, I saw it. Not too big, but perfect proportions, beautiful woodwork, this kind of balcony, gallery, wonderful. Well, what happened was, as so often happens, a developer, it was on the water, a developer bought it, and being a developer, wanted to take the house down, to raise it and build a new, wonderful, bigger and better sort of Mizner house. Well, by this time, people realized that Mizner was a valuable treasure, and there was an outcry. And they said, no, please, don't demolish it. Maybe you can, put a new bathroom in or something, but please. But anyway, what the developer agreed to do was he agreed to have somebody take the house and move it so he could have the site and build whatever he wanted on it. So they put this house on a barge, they sliced it in half, this is a half, they put it on a barge, and that is going through the bridge, inland waterway, see they're pushing it through. They put it on a barge and brought it from Manalapan into Palm Beach. And there it sat, I saw it, doing homage, there it sat on an empty lot on South Ocean Boulevard for some months, and then it was demolished. Nobody could really find enough money to put it together, and that was the end of that. So that goes to show, however, that there was some real sense of the value of Mizner's work, and of course now anything Mizner is incredible. This, I think you will recognize, it's the Mizner Park in Palm Beach. This was one of the last designs he made. It doesn't look like that now, but it's a wonderful example to me, apart from the houses, of Mizner's sense of proportion, the canal, the fountain at the end. And there it is, that we can all go and admire that. And if anyone's been to Spain, to the Generalife Garden in the Alhambra, the idea of the canal, and he doesn't have the fountains, in another place he had fountains, but it's the same sort of wonderful idea. And he did this with funds from friends. And so he still is around in his way. And here was, I think it's now not called the Ritz-Carlton, this is where we came in. I think it's called the Boca Raton Resort and Spa, probably you know. And a few years ago, I was on the internet and I Googled it. And it said, welcome to the Ritz-Carlton in Boca Raton. And then a little figure, moving figure, came on the screen, and it said, hello, I'm Addison Mizner, and I welcome you to my hotel. Well, it was the funniest thing. He sounded a bit Australian, I thought, and I don't think he would have minded, but basically, he looked like a waiter. So that's where we come in. He's a waiter, but he is still the great architect of Palm Beach, and always will be. Thank you very much. If you go upstairs to the Joseph Urban show on the second floor of this museum, Joseph Urban was an exact contemporary of Mizner. He was born in 1872, died in 1933. Exact contemporary, which makes it extremely interesting to see his work compared to Mizner's. Now, Joseph Urban did only, his great house here was Mar-a-Lago, which some might feel is a little over the top. And I think Joseph Urban was not comfortable in Mizner's aesthetic, shall we say. Urban was absolutely brilliant as a theatre designer and illustrator, and later, if you go and see his later work, has become the kind of cubist, modernist style that, in fact, overtook Mizner. But it's really interesting, if you're interested in comparative studies, to see these two very different artists at work at exactly the same time. Anyway, thank you. Are there any questions? Can't see it. I'm going to say one more thing, quickly. I just tore this page out of the Palm Beach magazine. I think it's called Palm Beach Magazine today. And it says, advertising real estate, Mizner-inspired estates. So, the man lives.
Go ahead, David. What is your favorite Mizner residence and why?
That's still standing.
Yes, ma'am.
I love the Villa Flora, which is it's a bit un-Mizner. It's a very pretty, rather simple house with Gothic windows, but very charming. And I love the one on the water called the Villa dei Fiori, Leone, which is on the waterfront. That's a beautiful, beautiful house. I happen to love the Villa El Sarmiento, but that's not so easy to see, but it's a very fine, fine, fine house. So those are my three favorites.
Thank you.
David.
Caroline, would you comment about Mizner's work in Southern California? I know he did the Biltmore Hotel in Santa Barbara. What happened? What did he do during those days he was in Southern California after he left Florida?
Well, I think he was hoping to settle there. I think he felt he'd, done his life in Florida, and he grew up in California, and the only sort of remaining member of the family was his niece, and she lived in Pebble Beach, California. And I think he was planning to go and build a house for himself there. So he went back and he did a couple of jobs. He also did a wonderful private house in Montecito. Absolutely beautiful, beautiful house with a fantastic garden and staircase, rather like the Villa Lante. So he had this little moment there. But I think he still had commitments in Palm Beach, and I think he just never had the energy in the end to do any more work out there. And then he got sick, and it was the end of it. So, but that was really, I think that was his home and his heart, actually, in the end. But he never got back there. He's buried there. Anything else? Anybody else? Yes?
The book that Alva Johnson wrote had some of the most outrageous Mizner stories in it. And later, I had read that most of those, the research on that book was done in the bars of Palm Beach, and some of those stories were not true.
I think almost all the stories were not true. But I mean, Mizner, both the Mizner, Wilson was hanging around here too, and Wilson, as you can see from my moments, was a terrific legend maker. And so, and Addison, he had a private life, and he went out rather discreetly with what he called pocket-sized Adonises. But that wasn't known very much. But I think people loved to gossip about Addison Mizner. He was larger than life, and walking down Worth Avenue with a monkey or a parrot and being greeted by everybody. Huge, he was very overweight. He was just an incredible character, and he was there all the time, and everybody knew him. And so, of course, people told stories all the time. And I think, but Johnson, it seems to me, he had a real animus against. Maybe it might have been against Wilson more than Addison, but he really had to go at him. But I've never found any truth in any of that stuff. So I think it was just gossip. It's probably something that now would be on YouTube, or something. Yes.
In Boynton Beach, there's a house that's on the National Register. It's closed, it's not used ordinarily. I thought Mizner's involved in that, and I thought the date was 1910. Could it be 1920?
It couldn't be 1910 because he didn't get down there till 1917, or Christmas 1917, Mizner. And I don't think he did a place. He did the Sea Island Cloister in Sea Island, Georgia. He did some other places than Palm Beach, a few other places. I'm not familiar with one in Boynton Beach, to tell you the truth. Sorry.
You have a question way in the back.
Yes.
What were the accomplishments of his siblings?
Very little. One of his brothers became a seminarian, and he was a kind of rather second-rate vicar somewhere. Edgar, the other brother, I think he became a lawyer, but kind of retired early and failed and sat at home. The brothers, none of them did as well as Addison or Wilson. The other two, 1, 2, 3, 4, there were two others. One died. None of them amounted to anything.
Question back here. Yes.
Did Mizner live in a house on Worth Avenue, just to the east of the courtyard where Mr. Brown was buried?
Yes, Mizner's, it's a fantastic building actually. Mizner built for himself that tower on Via Mizner. And if you look at it, you can see that the fantastic entry gate, and then on the top, you can see from out, there's a wonderful balcony sort of on the third floor, and then the top floor, you can see from the street, is what he called the Belvedere, which was his studio. And it's windows all the way around, and he has the most fantastic view all the way over Palm Beach. It was a really wonderful, wonderful place for him to live. And yes, that's where he It's where he lived and died. There's a wonderful photograph of when he died. There's a large armchair, picture of a large armchair, oversized because he was so oversized, armchair, where he'd sat, and there's a sort of dent in the cushion, and there are flowers around it, which was his sort of memorial space. It's a very touching photograph. But he lived there till he died.
Okay, one more question.
Did he do many commercial developments in this area?
No, none. I think the great commercial development was going to be Boca Raton, this great city. But I don't think he built any factories there. Have you just did houses? I think he just did houses. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, for ending this series in such a great way. Wonderful lecture. We learned a lot, I'm sure. If you'd like to know more about Addison Mizner's involvement in the Bank of Palm Beach and that whole bank failure that swept through Florida, there is a book available. It's out of print, but you can find it occasionally on Amazon. It's called Panic in Paradise. Addison Mizner was one of the investors in that bank, primarily to take the investors' money and invest it in Boca Raton. His apartment on Worth Avenue, by the way, is owned by Nick and Dee Adams, who've done a great job of bringing it back as much as possible to its original look. It's a beautiful apartment. We thank again PNC for their sponsorship of this series and the Palm Beach Post. Thank you for making this possible. I do know there were, as of just 2 minutes ago, 2 copies of Caroline's book about Mizner left, as well as 2 other titles she's authored, a historic novel set in World War I, and a book on the homes and gardens in New Jersey. So I'm sure she'd be happy to sign copies of those if you chose to add those to your collections. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to those who joined us online.
Thank you.